right, so I think one of the most impressive things as I was researching you, Jeff, is not how much LinkedIn has evolved over 11 years. I think you went from 300 some employees to 15,000, and hopefully everybody in the room has a LinkedIn profile, because that
LinkedIn profile, show of hands, let's see them. All right, it's about 100%.
Probably should have asked the opposite. You are among 645 million people, so good for you. But what really impressed me the most is that when you look at the Glassdoor reviews of CEOs, and there are 900,000 companies reviewed, Jeff is consistently in the top 10. I think you were up to number 4, now you've slipped to 8. But you have a 97% approval from your employees, and the average is around 66%. So congratulations on that. Tell us how you do that.
First of all, it's an absolute honor to be here. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. But any event that's in honor of Bill in any way, he had tremendous influence on me, and I shouldn't say it past tense because he continues to have a tremendous influence on me. I think that's one of the things that has made him so special. I'm not alone in that regard. He not only touched a lot of people, he continues to touch a lot of people. So it's an absolute honor to be here. With regard to the Glassdoor rankings, I typically, if I'm being honest, I don't typically put a lot of stock into lists like that. However, when it comes to Glassdoor, because it is generated based on employee feedback, it does mean more. So the fact that it's worked out for a number of years and the reviews have been positive is more meaningful because it's coming from our team. And I guess to some extent it's even more meaningful because it's anonymous. So you can say whatever you want without recriminations, and it's definitely a nice thing to be acknowledged like that. In terms of why people vote the way that they do, honestly, I wouldn't be able to say. If you were to ask me what are my first principles for leadership, regardless of that list, I would tell you first and foremost that it's managing compassionately. That is by far and away the most important management principle that I try to honor, that I aspire to. I say aspire because managing compassionately is difficult. And let's take a step back. There's a very clear distinction between empathy and compassion. A lot of people tend to use them synonymously, and I was one of those people. And I learned about the time I was 30, I read a book called The Art of Happiness, which is the teachings of the Dalai Lama. And it was in that book that he explains the difference. Empathy is feeling what another living thing feels. Compassion is putting yourself in the shoes of another person, seeing the world through their lens or perspective for the sake of alleviating their suffering. So more simply put, compassion is empathy plus action. And it's that element of action that is so key. In many regards, empathy is a means to the end of compassion and helping one another. And Bill absolutely embodied that. And the reason I say it's so difficult is because we are largely wired to be egocentric, not egomaniacal. You may have run across a few people in your time who's been egomaniacal. Egocentric is seeing the world through your own perspective, through your own lens. And we do that in large part to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves safe, to leverage our life experiences to make better decisions going forward. And so if you're constantly thinking about the world through your own lens, it's very difficult to put yourself in the shoes of other people. And yet, when you're responsible for others, when you're managing, when you're in a position of leadership, I believe it's absolutely essential to do that and to not necessarily expect other people around you to do things the way that you do, which would be very natural, especially if you've had some success in your life or your career, which is why you're in a position of responsibility to begin with. But in moments where you're dealing with others, especially when you're not seeing eye to eye, especially when there's conflict or friction, when we naturally default to our own tendencies, to our own way of seeing the world, that's when it is so critical to become a spectator to our own thoughts, especially when we become emotional, especially when we become triggered in these conflicts. And I don't mean like all-out battles. I'm talking about the natural day-in, day-out course of business where you disagree, you don't see eye to eye. And if you can become a spectator to your own thoughts in those moments and put yourself in the shoes of the other person and not just project your own perspective onto them, but to take the time to understand where they're coming from, why they have the opinion that they do, why they're angry or feeling insecure or vulnerable in that moment, you can forge a connection. You can better understand what they're trying to accomplish. You can de-escalate the situation. You can come together as a team. And I have found when you are able to not only practice that as an individual responsible for others, but at a larger organization, when that becomes foundational and you take the time to teach others that practice, that it's absolutely game-changing with regard to how a company ultimately can create value. Because not only are you building trust, not only are you there for one another, but at the end of the day, when you have that trust as a building block, you're able to make better decisions faster. You're able to develop shorthand. And it is not coincidence that if you were to look at the most valuable companies in the world, the median tenure of the people running those companies is much, much longer than anyone would have anticipated. 13, 14, 15, 18 years these people work together, and they develop that shorthand, which enables you to create that much more value over time. So that's kind of foundational.
So the Dalai Lama was a big influence on you. I have that book. It's one of my favorites, too. There was somebody else who was a huge influence, which is your wife, Lizette. Can you talk about, I always love hearing about the person behind the man. So tell me a little bit about what influence she had on you.
Yeah, it's interesting. That expression, the person behind the person, for me, she's not behind me. She's right alongside of me. She absolutely changed me in so many different ways, but I think most importantly, she introduced the concepts of kindness and generosity, and in a way compassion, without not necessarily using that word explicitly, but the importance of loving kindness. And I think up until meeting Lizette, I was just very much about the way I saw the world. I was also very much about work, and I enjoyed my work, but I was very intense, and I didn't have anything to counterbalance that intensity. And she just changed that. She changed the way I felt, she changed the way I thought, she changed the way I started to think about others and treat other people. And I'll tell you a fun anecdote that'll kind of characterize that change. So I was at Yahoo as an executive. That's where I started to aspire to practice compassionate management. And trust me, I was not always a compassionate manager. And after meeting my wife several months later, we had a vacation scheduled or something to that effect. And I was at a staff meeting, and somebody commented on me pre-Lizette and me post-Lizette in terms of the difference in my behavior and how much more they all enjoyed being in my company post-Lizette. So she just, she's had a very significant influence on me.
That's great. Yeah. So I love how you reframed the woman, your partner next to you. That was beautiful. Brad spoke this morning about the importance of finding your why. I'd love to hear you share.
Is
Brad here?
Is Brad still here? You have to take off? Okay.
But I'd love to hear you talk about that. I think a lot of the people in the room are searching for their why, and I'm sure you have some wisdom on that.
So, well, no pun intended on the wisdom, as you'll hear in just a second, because that's part of the why. But just show of hands, if you were to characterize your career objective as something that you have a lot of clarity on, just raise your hand if you know what it is you ultimately want to accomplish. Show of hands. How many people have a very clear understanding of that? And show of hands, how many people don't feel like they're as clear in terms of what it is they ultimately, wow, okay. So, very good question, it looks like, for this audience.
A lot of that.
So, this is actually the question I'm most frequently asked when on stage in front of a group like this that's earlier on in their career. It's certainly the most frequently asked question I get when meeting with our interns, when meeting with new hires. And it never ceases to amaze me how many people later on in their career don't necessarily know what it is that they want to accomplish. So I have had a personal vision now for what I'd like to accomplish for roughly 10, 11 years. It started right before I joined LinkedIn, and it's to help expand the world's collective wisdom and compassion. And that's true north for me. That's the vision. And I distinguish between vision and mission. For me, a vision's true north. It's the dream. It's there to inspire. Mission is a singular overarching objective, measurable, realizable, hopefully inspirational. But this is my personal vision. And it has infused every part of what I do on a day-to-day basis. And What's interesting to me when meeting with folks like yourselves who don't necessarily have clarity in terms of your why, what it is that you want to accomplish, it's interesting how little time people typically spend defining that for themselves. And it's interesting, if you go back to your football careers, at the onset of every season, I'm pretty sure your coach had a very specific objective or set of objectives for the team and for you personally. And you probably developed similar objectives with the strength coach or the trainers in terms of what you wanted to be able to accomplish in terms of your personal fitness. And for those of you in the workforce, I'm fairly certain your company has specific measurable objectives, and so do you with regard to your day-to-day job. Imagine doing any of that without a clear understanding of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And you think like that, and it's like, well, of course not. Why would I ever do that? And yet that's what so many of us do with regard to our careers. We just go. We just go. And we react. We react to job offers, and we react to new opportunities, and we react to doors being open. And there's nothing wrong with that, especially if you don't know what it is you ultimately want to accomplish. But it's so important to take the time to define for yourself what that is. And one exercise that I do with folks is I say, look out for this median age group, I would say, look out 30, 40 years. And then look back on your career. And what do you want to say you accomplished? And then use that as a true north to help you make decisions between now and that point. When it comes to defining what that is, for me at least, there have been two things to keep in mind. And that is what I am passionate about and where my skills lie. And if you can define your career objective at the intersection of those two things, you are very, very likely to have success. And it's interesting because a lot of people, they focus on one at the exclusion of the other. They focus on the things that they're most passionate about, regardless of whether or not they have the requisite skill or aptitude or potential. And some of you may be thinking to yourself, well, you can do absolutely anything. Yes, within reason. I love the Warriors. I'm a huge Warriors fan, Golden State Warriors. I'm a huge Steph Curry fan. I love watching Steph Curry play basketball. I would love to be able to play basketball like Steph Curry. That's not going to happen. I am not going to be a starting point guard in the NBA. It's not going to happen. I can translate that passion to things I'm better at. Maybe I could work in the front office. Maybe I could work for the general manager. Maybe I could aspire to work my way up that way. But it's very important to not just focus on passion. And similarly, it's very important to not just focus on skill. And that is also a trap that people fall into. Golden handcuffs, some of you may have heard that expression before. If you're really, really good at something that creates value, people are going to reward you for that. And you may be attracted by those rewards. But over time, without passion, you're not going to be happy at all. And I'm reminded of a book. Andre Agassi wrote a book called Open, his autobiography. And a lot of people didn't realize the pain he had experienced and the struggles he had as a professional tennis player, given all the success that he had enjoyed. But he was miserable playing tennis for most of his career. He hated it, so much so that later in his career he turned to drugs while he was a professional tennis player. And a lot of people had no idea about this. But he was pushed into tennis at a young age by a father who was projecting his own aspirations onto his son. And he lost the joy in it. And for many years, he struggled to fulfill his potential until he connected with that gap and recognized his lack of passion, and then found it again and became the best tennis player in the world much later on in his career than anyone could have anticipated. So it's not just about finding the thing that you're passionate about. It's not just about finding the thing that you're good at. It's about finding the intersection of those two things, and then using that to clearly define what it is you ultimately want to accomplish. And if you don't know, and a lot of folks here don't, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, especially given many of you are just starting out on your career. And to those folks, I would say, try different things. Trial and error. It's a big world out there. You've got a lot of options. Try different things, things that you may never have guessed would be for you. Because some of those things are going to resonate in ways you never would have expected, and you're going to develop skills that you have that you never would have anticipated. And through that trial and error, you're going to get closer and closer to understanding what it is you want to accomplish. And then once you're able to explicitly acknowledge that, that's when the magic happens. And I don't mean in some new age predeterministic or fatalistic way because you define it just magically happens. I mean when you know what it is that you want, what it is you want to do, it starts to manifest itself explicitly and implicitly. The people around you understand what it is you want to accomplish and start opening doors for you. They start making the introductions. They start asking the right questions. They start providing the right kind of advice. And implicitly, it will help you make decisions that bring you closer and closer to that endpoint.
I love that advice. I've certainly found that true in my life as well. I know that you, in a more tactical way, are a believer in the power of routines.
Yeah.
You set daily goals, you create margin and buffer, you meditate, you see your family, you sleep. Talk a little bit about how that works and maybe something that they can take away from your routine.
Sure, but my guess is this group doesn't need as much advice on the routine front as most because of your backgrounds, because of the success that you've already enjoyed. My guess is many of you have strong routines. When I was your age, suffice it to say, I did not. I did not have any routine. I hated the idea of routine. It felt stifling and boring. And as I've gotten older, I've realized the extraordinary power of routine. And I now believe in it to the point where I don't think I'd be capable of currently doing my job if I didn't have routine. And so it's something that developed over time. But once I started in my current role, it was something I really needed to honor. So when I talk about routine, I'm talking about the time I wake up.
What time is that?
It's between 5:30 and 6:30 typically. After our first daughter was born, I was never a morning person until then. And
changes you.
In a lot of ways. And I was always an alarm clock guy. I needed the alarm clock, the snooze, the whole thing. But she's 11 now, and I haven't used an alarm clock since, thankfully. So at any rate, I wake up around the same time each morning. I work out on certain days. I try to meditate every day. Spend time with the kids and my wife before I head off to work. You mentioned one of the practices at work. I have 90 minutes of buffer time every day. Every day.
Is that all in one chunk?
It can be 90 minutes of one block, which is unusual. It can be an hour and then 30 minutes. It can be 3 30-minute blocks, which is more common. And this buffer time, it's literally buffer. If you were to look at a printout of my calendar, you would see blocks of time that are grayed out. And when I first started my job, and for many, many years I was in business, I just assumed I had to have every minute scheduled. And then if I didn't have every minute scheduled, I wasn't doing my job. And it's the exact opposite. Especially with greater and greater influence in an organization, greater responsibility, you must have time to catch your breath, to think, to synthesize, to connect dots, time to allow for serendipitous conversations in the hallway, time for an open door so that someone can come into your office with a problem that they have and wasn't scheduled, time to think big, and develop strategy, sometimes for super mundane stuff like clearing out your inbox so you don't feel like you're constantly trying to catch up. That's a critical part of my routine. I try to get home for dinner with my wife and the kids every night. I'll schedule, if I'm doing any business meetings in the evening, I'll go home first before I'll go out. So this routine has really been valuable for me. And it was not something I appreciated when I was younger, to say the least.
That's great. One last question about Bill, and then I'm going to open it up, so be thinking of your questions. So you got to know Bill quite well. You were on the Intuit board together. Can you tell a little bit about a mentoring moment with Bill or any mentoring advice for the audience?
Yeah, so it's interesting with Bill, and we were talking a little bit about this beforehand. Bill, I wish in retrospect I had spent more time with Bill in an explicit mentor-mentee relationship. What I learned from Bill was largely through observation, being on the board of Intuit with him. And we would spend time together outside of the boardroom talking about Intuit from time to time, talking about what's happening in the Valley. But the lessons I learned from Bill were less explicit moments of mentorship and more observation. And what I observed watching Bill was his authenticity and the power of his authenticity, his honesty, and his gratitude. Those are 3 things that come to mind probably first and foremost, and there's many more where that came from. But Bill is one of the most authentic human beings I've ever met. My guess is most people who knew Bill well would start there. He was just very comfortable in his own skin. He knew exactly who he was. And he would do things I had never seen up until that point. I've never seen since. We'd be we'd be in a board meeting, like, you know, very high stakes, like lots of gravitas, serious. Someone would say something, some outperformance, they'd be talking about a win. In the middle of the board meeting, Bill would start doing this. And I don't mean like a slow clap or anything like that. I mean like your coach does on the sideline. Let's go, folks, let's go. And I was like,
he was the only one clapping?
He's the only one clapping. And in the Intuit boardroom, people have been so used to it for so long, they just kept going. That's Bill. Mm-hmm. The first few times I saw it, I was like, what is this guy doing? Like, that's kind of weird. This isn't a football field, it's a boardroom. And then you realize it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And he was just always himself. One-on-one, boardroom, on a stage, the best of times, the worst of times. He knew exactly who he was. So authenticity. Second was honesty. He was honest. And this is an offshoot of being authentic. If you're going to be true to yourself, you're going to be true with others constantly. But man, was he honest. And when times were tough, he was going to give you a kick in the ass. And he was going to give you the tough love that you needed. He was not going to just pat you on the back. It wasn't always about feel-good moments. He was going to call out things that could be done better. And he would do it in that inimitable Bill way. And then similarly, he was always honest and upfront with the praise. And it meant that much more because he was so transparent when it came to the things you needed to be doing better and differently. If he was constantly praising people all the time, it wouldn't have meant as much. But because you knew with Bill, what he saw was what you got, you know? So that was incredibly powerful. And then a byproduct of that honesty was his gratitude. And he was never hesitant to express his appreciation for folks. And it was so deeply heartfelt. And we were talking earlier about my wife and this idea of loving kindness. It's the way Bill lived his life. To this day, I have never walked the halls of any organization, not just Intuit, that he had helped build for years. He would visit me at LinkedIn. Why he would have known anyone at LinkedIn, I have no idea. He couldn't take 3 steps without someone running up and hugging him. I mean hugging, like, Bill! Like running into his arms. This is a guy, you heard Eric talking about the fact that seemingly everyone described him as their best friend. He was either best friend or mentor. And when I first heard it, I used to think people they had to have been exaggerating because you can't have one person be the best friend and mentor to hundreds and hundreds of people. You could with Bill.
Absolutely. I was at his service, and the number of people who thought they were his best friend was astonishing. What questions do you have for Jeff?
How do you balance having a very structured routine day with the ability to be flexible and adapt to the needs of that specific day?
It's a great question. That's where that buffer comes into play. That's where that 90 minutes a day comes into play. When every minute of every day is scheduled, you have no flexibility whatsoever. And it stacks up, it compounds on itself. And it creates a sense of falling behind and I think an intensity that can be distracting. So in addition to everything coming at you normally, that energy does not help you navigate the day in, day out. Do you guys, I'm going to be way dating myself, but does anyone here ever watch reruns of I Love Lucy ever? Does anyone even know what that is? Yeah, there's like 6 hands. Thank you, Stan. Very famous, one of the original sitcoms, believe it or not. And there's the scene, you can look this up on YouTube after this. At any rate, there's very funny comedic moments. There's this brilliant comedian who starred in Lucille Ball. She and her partner, Ethel, Ethel in this case, her best friend, they were in a chocolate candy factory. And they were trying to prove to their husbands that they could work and be productive. And they were assigned wrapping chocolates coming through an assembly line. And they got dressed up in their appropriate uniform, and they were feeling really good about themselves. And their boss was kind of mean and very harsh, like, you must make sure none of these chocolates fall to the floor. And they're like, okay. And then the boss leaves, and the assembly line starts moving, and it's moving real slow. And they're like taking the chocolate, they're wrapping it up, and they're feeling really good about themselves. And then the assembly line starts moving a little bit faster, and they start to get a little panicky, and then it just starts going full speed. And they're taking it and they're shoving it in their mouths and down the uniform, and this stuff's falling, and you can see the panic. And we've all been there. And whether it's the stuff coming at you, whether it's your inbox, you don't want to be operating, especially from a position of leadership, because you're setting the tone. And if you're constantly reacting and constantly catching up and constantly back on your heels, you can't do your job the way you need to do your job. And I'll be even more specific than that. There are at least two continuums that need to be navigated as leaders as you scale an organization. The first is moving from tactical execution to strategy, and the second is moving from problem solving to coaching. If you want to scale an organization, you need to successfully navigate both of those transitions. So what do I mean by this? When you first start, if you're going to start a company, if you join a startup, it's all about getting it done. You have a vision, you got to build the prototype to generate financing, and then you get the financing, then you got to build it and generate an audience. And then once you have an audience, you need to generate a mechanism for monetization. You've got to get it done. As you continue to evolve over time, if you are constantly in the trenches, doing the day-to-day, you're not thinking forward. You're not thinking about the competition. You're not looking around corners. You're not developing the right strategy. You're not evolving your vision, your mission. And that's not going to scale. So that's the first continuum. And the second is you're in the trenches and you're getting it done. And you're being rewarded for getting it done for many, many years. But then over time you want to scale. You can't keep putting out the fires yourself. You need to train other people to be able to do that. And then the real scale happens when you're coaching them so well that they can coach others. That's how you scale. In order to make both of those transitions, you need time. More than anything else, whether it's 90 minutes of buffer a day or some other mechanism, you need time to be able to have the flexibility that you were asking about.
Great. We have time for one more question because he's meeting with Scott Cook in 10 minutes. So, Dan, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
LinkedIn sits at such a unique intersection of being able to see all kinds of patterns in employment and kind of work as we know it. What do you think are big changes that are going to happen over our careers and our lifetimes in the future of work?
So there's a few different things I would call out. The first is no surprise, and that's going to be the disruptive impact of technology, and specifically artificial intelligence, robots, automation. There's a lot of people that are going to be impacted, depending on which analyst or consulting firm or experts you talk to. Tens of millions, some would say, hundreds of millions more broadly on a global basis within the next decade or so. And there's a question as to whether or not this displacement that takes place when technology displaces a worker, an employee, whether or not that person is going to be able to reskill themselves to take advantage of new opportunities that are being created. And to the extent we're successful as a global workforce in reskilling people, because new opportunities are always created at these disruptive moments, at these inflection points, economic inflection points, then we're going to continue to see growth, and we're going to continue to see people who are productive. We have to be very mindful of this, because to the extent people continue to be displaced and they're not able to find access to economic opportunity, the socioeconomic stratification that we're all experiencing today, and the sense of us against them, this inherent tribalism that continues to intensify, the opportunity divide that many of us are trying to close, it's going to get worse. So proactively trying to understand which industries and which roles are going to be most impacted by technology, and then getting ahead of it to the greatest extent possible and reskilling individuals, that's going to help. So what kind of skills should we be teaching at this point? Most people immediately knee-jerk to advanced technology, which if you can get that kind of education, you're going to be set up for a while. There's a massive supply-demand imbalance in terms of AI, in terms of cloud computing, in terms of storage, in terms of data analysis. Not everyone's going to be able to get access to those skills in a time period that makes sense for them. So somewhat counterintuitively, the good news is the largest skills gap right now, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere in the world, same in every market, is not advanced technology. It's soft skills like communication. Written communication, oral communication, leadership, collaboration, program management, project management, sales development, business development. And the fantastic news is not only is this kind of education available to everyone, and not only can we all get better at that stuff, But those skills and the roles that require those skills are going to be the last to be disrupted by the technology I was just describing. It's going to be a long time before AI is able to manage a group of people successfully and bring them together and inspire them and have many of the same qualities you saw in the video earlier that Bill so beautifully demonstrated day in and day out.
So we can have artificial intelligence, but it's hard to have artificial wisdom. So thank you very much for your time, Jeff. We really appreciate it.